3, 2, 1.
All right, sorry my last video got cut off, but picking back up with data tables, I asked that you guys do number 9, and now we're going to review what should your data table for this experiment look like. So for today's experiment, you must make sure that you have a descriptive title. So you're trying to find the melting point of wax by applying heat over time. That is a descriptive title. You also must make sure that any rows or columns you have labels. And if you're measuring something like time, you need to make sure that you have a unit for time. So time is too vague. I don't know if you're measuring minutes, hours, seconds. You need to make sure that there's units. And then, of course, that there's space to record your data. So I'm quickly going to try and draw what your table should look like. If it does not look like what I'm drawing now, you need to correct it after we've reviewed. So your table should have looked something like... I'm not going to draw the title. I'm just going to draw the table, but make sure you also have a title. So it was a simple table. All you needed to do was have 2 columns, and one column was titled time with your units. That would be minutes. And then your second column would have been titled temperature with your units, whether you decided Celsius or Fahrenheit, either one is fine. And then below that, you would have had 10 rows, one for each of the 10 minutes that you're recording the time or recording the temperature for your wax. So it would have been 1, 2, and then you would have continued until you had 10 rows. So this is what your table should have looked like. If it does not look like this, you need to pause the video and you need to make sure that you have something that reflects what you see on the screen now. Great, so now we're going to move on to part 5, which is graphing. So for graphs, make sure that you record the following in your notebook so you have this to reference later. All graphs should include a descriptive title. It can be the same title that you use to describe your table. That's absolutely fine. All graphs need to have X and Y axes labeled, and those labels need to have units. So if you're measuring time, again, make sure that it has units. If you're measuring temperature, make sure it has a unit. In regards to which is your X and which is your Y axes, you need to go back to your independent and dependent variables and make sure that your independent variables on the X axis and your dependent variables on the Y axis. Also, if there is data given, you need to make sure that your data is plotted correctly. For today's experiment, obviously we haven't collected data, so you won't have data to plot. Question number 10 says to design a graph for today's investigation in the space provided below. You just need to set up the graph with the title and labeled axes. You obviously won't have data to plot. So based off of what I just said, all graphs must include, you need to pause the video, fill in this graph here with what are the elements of a high-level graph. Once you are finished, you can press play and we'll continue. Great, so what your graph should look like is what I have here. You should, of course, have a title. It can match the same title that you used for your data tables. As my y-axis, I have my independent variable, which is temperature. I also have my units, which I had were Celsius. And then my x-axis is my independent variable, which is time, and I included my units, which are minutes. So if your graph does not reflect what you're seeing on the board now, you need to pause the video, you need to make some corrections, and then you can press play when you're ready to come back. Cool, so now we're going to move on to part 6, which is modeling. So all models should include the following, and they should be recorded in your notebooks. All models need to have a descriptive title, as with our graphs, as with data tables. All models should include a key, they should include labels, and they should be neat and organized. If you look at question number 11, it says to complete the model of melting in the space provided below. Today we were looking at the phase change melting, so now I want you to draw me a model of what does a solid look like, and then what does a liquid look like, or what happens to molecules when they go through the phase change melting. It says your model needs to represent how molecular motion is affected during the phase change melting. Make sure your model matches the key provided. So the key that I have here, I have below. It shows us some arrows. And so what you're going to draw is you're going to draw what does the wax look like as a solid? What does it look like when it goes through the phase change melting and becomes a liquid? You need to draw the molecules themselves, and then you need to include these arrows here to reflect the speed at which molecules are moving as a solid and the speed in which they're moving as a liquid. So what you see is you have a short arrow. This indicates that molecules are moving at a low speed. You have a medium length arrow, which indicates that molecules are moving at a moderate speed, and then you have a long arrow, which indicates that molecules are moving at a very high speed. So when you're going from a solid to a liquid during the process of melting, you need to describe what do molecules look like when they start off as a solid, and what do they look like when they end the phase change melting and are a liquid. You need to make sure that you're drawing molecules as well, in addition to the arrows. So the molecules can just be dots, and then you need to draw arrows in between the molecules to represent the motion of the molecules. So pause the video, do your model. When you're ready and you're finished, you can press play and we'll review. Great, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna talk through what your models should look like. If for any reason your models are not reflective of what I talk about, then you need to go back and you need to make edits. So when you were drawing your first model, when it was wax molecules in the form of a solid, you should have drawn your molecules, obviously, and then you should have drawn the shorter arrows in between those molecules because you are a solid and molecules are moving very slowly in that form of matter. When they go through the phase change melting, you go from a solid into a liquid, and so the molecules are increasing their kinetic energy, they're increasing their temperature, and they're increasing their speed of motion. And you could have represented that by showing the medium length arrows. You did not want to do the long arrows because long arrows are associated with gases, and we were only going from a solid into a liquid. So if your model did not reflect what I just said, you need to go back, you need to make edits, and then you can press play when you have done so. Great, so the last thing that I'm asking you to do today in class is number 12. It says make revisions to study guide questions 3, 11, 12, 13, and 14. All of these questions are going to be related to what I have just discussed in both of our videos from today's class. They're going to be a review of making high-level data tables, making graphs, putting together procedures, and drawing models or interpreting models. So you need to go back, you need to make revisions to those questions, and in general, over the weekend, you need to make sure that you're revising all of the work on your study guide. What I've given you for a grade, as I said, or as the sub has said to you, is an effort grade. I've given you a check, check plus, check minus. That's only your effort grade. It's not your actual grade in terms of correctness. You're going to give me back your study guides on Monday, and at that time, I'm going to grade for whether or not your responses were correct or incorrect. I've given you point values for what that might look like if you make no corrections over the weekend. So you need to make sure that number 1, you don't lose your study guide. Number 2, you're making corrections over the weekend, and that you hand it back in to me on Monday. If you have any further questions or concerns, you can absolutely email me, and I'd be happy to take your questions over the weekend. As well, you'll also find another video being uploaded to Google Classroom over the weekend in which I'm going to address some common misconceptions that I saw on the study guide overall across the 7th grade to help you prep and help you make sure that you're making those corrections and you're understanding why you're making those corrections. So stay tuned for that. I'll email it out. I'll post it on Google Classroom. I will make sure that you know that it is there. Great. Have a wonderful weekend. I miss you all, and I will see you Monday.